Over the last 501 episodes, we've talked a lot about Cardano the ecosystem, Cardano the network, Cardano the technology stack, and Cardano the more level global economic playing field. But the whole time, there's also been this notion that a blockchain ecosystem could also be a political framework where governance can happen. I think on a long enough timeline, this governance could expand greatly in scope, and that maybe there's a future when being a citizen of a government's jurisdiction isn't determined by geography, but by reason and choice. That might be a little ways off, but governance of the ecosystem is not. In fact, it's arriving right now to Cardano in the form of SIP 1694, and it might be one of the most important things Cardano has ever done. Ready? Let's go. This is going to be the big, giant SIP 1694 episode. We're going to go through every single section of this Cardano improvement proposal, which lays out the framework to bootstrap Voltaire, and I'm going to tell you why I think it's a pretty good starting place. This episode is sponsored by Iha Apothecary of Ireland. You might be a gnarly crypto person who never gives a thought to skincare, but you probably do have a significant other or loved ones who very much care about their skin, and this would be a great option to get them a very unique and special gift for the holidays. Their products include natural ingredients like seaweed, lady's mantle, camellia oil, Rosa damascena flowers, huckleberries, and peat. They say their products contain ethically sourced and locally produced Irish peat. Their ethos is to sustainably and ethically extract their peat to maintain and protect their beautiful Irish bogs. They never test on animals, only on themselves. They've got all kinds of products from serums to masks to sheet masks, even a book of fairy and folk tales of Ireland, all kinds of bundles. Check them out, Iha Apothecary, link in the description box below. If you can't decide what to get, or if you're a last minute shopper worried about global shipping times, they also have gift card vouchers. And there's a discount code just for us, SPIES25, SPIES25, that gives you a 25% discount. This is the one. We are finally going to discuss SIP 1694. You already know what it is. That's the year when this guy, Voltaire, was born. And SIP 1694 is going to bootstrap the Voltaire era in Cardano. This is going to be the era when we finally do the thing we've been talking about, and that's self-govern the entire ecosystem. And I will say right off the bat, it's a very interesting tricameral system that they've come up with. And it does have quite a few little mechanisms that go in the direction of checks and balances. And I think this is a very good starting place. Obviously, government and bureaucracy is like an octopus that never stops growing. The tentacles just get thicker and longer, and they keep growing. I don't mean that in a nefarious way, like the tentacles are evil. I'm just saying we all know how organizations like this work. As they encounter more and more edge cases and new developments, they have to grow and become bigger and more complicated. So what we're seeing in this SIP is just a bootstrapping of this governance era, but it is surely to get fleshed out more and more infinitely as time goes on. Also, you probably noticed that the whisper intro, ready, let's go, has risen from the grave like a zombie that will not die. The reaction I got after killing it yesterday was the exact opposite of what I thought I would get. So, based on the comments I used to get about it during the bull market, it seemed like a small number of people liked it, and it really irritated a large number of people, which I thought was kind of funny. But it turns out during the bear market, it's a slightly different crowd. I think the people who listen to this channel are a lot more in the Cardano ecosystem. We're kind of like true Cardano people. I think the people still around, and it's definitely a different set of preferences. And apparently things have switched. Yesterday, I got a few people who were like, thank goodness the Whisper intro is gone. But they were actually the tiny minority. And the vast majority of people who I heard from were missing the Whisper intro. They felt like maybe it shouldn't have died. That was enough for me. So I'm bringing back the Whisper intro. Who knows? Maybe once we get back into another one of those big growth phases, who knows? Late 2024, 2025. Who knows when that'll happen? But maybe when we get back into one of those phases, the Whisper intro will have to go back away as we have more new people coming into Cardano. But for now, Whisper intro back like a zombie risen from the grave. Here we have the actual SIP, the Cardano Improvement Proposal 1694, a proposal for entering the Voltaire phase. And it's pretty well laid out. I mean, you can tell a lot of thought has gone into this. And this was not done haphazardly. A huge amount of thought has gone into this proposal. And it's pretty good as far as starting places for something like this, which I regard to be something that's never been done before. I don't think anyone's ever done something like this before. You can see right off the bat that the authors of this SIP will be at least somewhat familiar. Almost all of them will be somewhat familiar to anybody who's active in the ecosystem. So we've got Charles Hoskinson, Samuel Leathers, Kevin Hammond, Matthias Bancourt, and Jared Cordowan. Before we jump into the framework for bootstrapping Voltaire that's laid out in this SIP, let's talk about how things currently work. Currently, governance transactions are initiated by special transactions that require signature by 5 out of 7 Cardano governance keys, and these keys are held by the founding entities. This is how parameter changes to the Cardano base layer are currently made, including hard forks. And this was always intended to be a transitional form of governance until we got to Voltaire. And you'll notice as we go through this SIP, there are a lot of things that are of a transitional nature, which is, I think, the right way to do this. You definitely want to sort of ease into something this big, so you have time to kind of look around and see what's working, see what's not working, and kind of optimize as you go along. So we've got some base elements here. We've got a governance action. A governance action is something that any Cardano user can submit. 3 distinct groups will then vote to ratify or not ratify the governance action. A constitutional committee, number 1. Number 2, DReps. And number 3, stake pool operators. So DReps are referenced here as delegation representatives. I've heard people use slightly modified terminology to reference them in the past. Delegated representatives, various forms of this, but here it's actually referenced as delegation representatives. So you notice this is a tricameral legislative body. So all 3 of these sort of chambers of one body that is sort of passing the equivalent of legislation, basically, they're all kind of involved. It's sort of like a bicameral system, as in the US, with a US House of Representatives and a US Senate. So they'll all 3 kind of be involved in different ways, but there are some sort of checks and balances between these three bodies. So let's talk a little bit about DReps, just so you understand. We'll go through each of these bodies. I think you already understand who the stake pool operators are, but the DReps could be any ADA holder. Any ADA holder could register to be a DRep, and they could represent themselves. They could vote their own ADA. Or alternatively, they could delegate the voting rights to the ADA they hold to any registered DRep. So as an ADA holder, you've got a choice. You could be a DRep yourself and represent yourself, or you could delegate your voting rights to anyone who is registered as a DRep. Before we get to the actual constitutional committee, which is the third part of this tricameral legislative body, including the DReps and the stake pool operators as well, we have to address the fact that there will be a Cardano Constitution. So this is just a text document to record the shared values, guiding principles, and ethos underpinning the ecosystem. It's an off-chain document, but a hash of the text will be recorded on-chain. It's not currently envisioned to be a set of on-chain rules or laws, at least in the short term here, but maybe one day it can evolve into a smart contract-based set of actual rules driving the government framework. So we've got this tricameral legislative body that's sort of ratifying governance actions that any of us can submit. And then we've got the Cardano Constitution. Now let's talk about the Constitutional Committee. So at all times, this Constitutional Committee will either be in a normal state or a state of no confidence. And don't worry, we'll get to who's actually on the committee. But so we've got two states it can be in: a normal state or a state of no confidence. And this kind of thing will be very familiar to anybody who's in a jurisdiction where the government uses a parliamentarian system. If you have a parliament, you're kind of used to governments, and these no confidence votes that force the government out of power, and then a new coalition is formed and a new government, which can exist in what would be called a normal state here, not a state of no confidence, can come in and it can kind of do the executive body functions. So we've got a similar thing here with the Constitutional Committee. It can either be in a normal state or a state of no confidence. And we'll talk about how those two things happen. If it's in a state of no confidence, it cannot participate in governance actions, and it must be replaced before any governance actions can be enacted. So if it is in a state of no confidence, all of a sudden, the Constitutional Committee cannot actually ratify any governance action, and you need to replace it with a new Constitutional Committee before you do anything else. The initial Constitutional Committee will be the core members of a members-based organization that will likely include IOG and the Cardano Foundation and some key community actors. There are two ways to replace the Constitutional Committee. The Constitutional Committee itself plus the DReps can both approve replacement of the Constitutional Committee if it's in a normal state. So if it's in a normal state and the Constitutional Committee agrees that it should be replaced and the DReps agree that it should be replaced, then those two parts of the tricameral legislative body can replace the Constitutional Committee. If it's in a state of no confidence, the SPOs and the DReps can vote to replace the Constitutional Committee. So obviously, if it's in a state of no confidence, this means that everybody else probably wants to replace the Constitutional Committee. So if it's in a state of no confidence, just the SPOs and the DReps can vote to replace the Constitutional Committee. But if for some reason it's the right time for the Constitutional Committee to be replaced, even it agrees, then just the Constitutional Committee itself and the DReps could vote to replace the Constitutional Committee. There is no fixed size or quorum for the Constitutional Committee. It can be varied whenever a new committee is installed. So if you have a vote of no confidence and you replace the Constitutional Committee, or if it's done the other way and it's in a normal state, if it's replaced, you can also decide how big you want that Constitutional Committee to be. So there will be 6 different types of governance actions. You can see them here. So number 1, a motion of no confidence in the Constitutional Committee. Number 2, an action to change the members of the Constitutional Committee or its quorum size. So quorum size would be the signature threshold. How many people on the Constitutional Committee need to sign out of the total number of people? How many of those people need to sign in order for the Constitutional Committee to ratify something? Number 3 would be updates to the Constitution. And the fact that that's one of the governance action types tells you that the Constitution is going to be a living document. It's not going to be frozen in time forever. It's going to be a living document that can be updated. So whether that's true of everything in the Constitution, only some parts of it, we don't know yet because we don't have a Constitution yet. And we'll get to that. Number 4, hard fork initiation. This would be any non-backwards compatible change. And it would also require a prior software upgrade. Number 5 would be protocol parameter changes. And number 6 would be treasury withdrawals, which will be classified as either small, medium, or large. So, like I said at the beginning, any ADA holder could submit one of these governance actions, a governance action, which would be one of those 6 types we just went over. So, to prevent spamming, because anyone can submit these, they're permissionless, obviously, people, nefarious actors would probably be submitting all kinds of governance actions all day that, these 3 bodies in the tricameral, ratifying body would have to look at. So to prevent spamming, there has to be a governance deposit that will be returned once the governance action is ratified, dropped, or expired. So that tells you right there that there's 3 possible things that can happen with a governance action. It can be ratified, it can be dropped, or it can expire. Ratification of governance actions will happen through on-chain voting. And different types of governance actions will have different ratification requirements involving specific combinations of the following: a certain quorum vote of the Constitutional Committee, a certain stake-controlled threshold of DReps, and a certain stake-controlled threshold of SPOs. So in this section, they're telling you exactly how ratification is going to be measured in each of these chambers of this tricameral ratifying body. So in the Constitutional Committee, there will be a number of votes that meets the quorum threshold. With the DReps, it's going to be a certain threshold of stake. With the SPOs, again, a certain threshold of stake. So that leads us to this next chart. So this chart is kind of the heart and soul of how things are going to get ratified in this system. So it looks really complicated right now as we look at it, and that's because there's a bunch of values in here that haven't quite gotten determined. There's some other things like these X's and heavy check marks that are a little bit more binary, but the rest of these are sort of different types of thresholds that haven't been decided yet. They're open for discussion. So this looks a lot more complicated than it actually is, but once you get into it, it becomes pretty simple. So in this chart, you can see the governance actions marked with heavy check mark require a vote of the Constitutional Committee. So right here, you see heavy check mark. This means the Constitutional Committee needs to vote on that particular type of governance action. And those include changing the members or quorum vote of the Constitutional Committee in a normal state, updating the Constitution, hard forks, protocol parameter changes, or treasury withdrawals of any size. You can also see that the SPO vote is only considered if something called the active voting stake threshold, which is explained up in this paragraph, is not met, or if it's one of the governance actions marked with an X, these ones over here, a motion of no confidence in the Constitutional Committee, an action to install a new Constitutional Committee, or a quorum vote in a state of no confidence, or a hard fork. So in some governance actions, the SPO vote will not be necessary if there is sufficient active voting stake. If I'm understanding correctly, in those cases, the governance actions would require endorsement only by the Constitutional Committee and the DReps. So if enough people are voting, you'll have certain types of these governance actions that could be endorsed and effectuated just by votes of the Constitutional Committee and the DReps. But then you've got those categories I covered where the SPOs will also vote. And you've also got a situation where the number of people voting doesn't meet the active voting stake threshold. And in those cases, also the SPOs will vote. So governance actions will be checked for ratification only on epoch boundaries, and only one governance action of each type can be staged for enactment in any given epoch. Votes can be a yes, a no, or an abstain. So you can actually abstain. Even if you're a registered DRep, you can abstain from voting if that's the right thing to do for some reason. An abstaining vote doesn't count for active voting stake. If you want to change your vote, you can actually just vote again and it will override any older votes. The progress of a governance action will be tracked on chain, showing things like when it expires, the total yes, no, and abstain votes of each of the committees, the DReps, and the SPOs. So again, I think this chart is really the heart and soul of this framework. This is really how things get ratified, who has what powers to ratify what. So it looks complicated, but I think we can break this down pretty easily. The DReps are kind of voting all the time. The Constitutional Committee is voting a lot of the time, unless it's a motion of no confidence or if it's a new committee or quorum determination. Then obviously the Constitutional Committee doesn't vote. It doesn't make sense for the Constitutional Committee to be voting on a motion of no confidence in the Constitutional Committee. The SPOs are voting if the active voting stake threshold isn't met. So that would be here and here. That would be in the case of setting a new committee or constitutional committee quorum or an update to the Constitution. But then there are some other places where the symbol X indicates that the AVST will be ignored and only the DREP and SPO votes will be considered regardless of the active voting stake threshold. And those spots are motion of no confidence, new committee, and quorum, again, like so that the DReps aren't voting by themselves, because we already said that the Constitutional Committee will not be voting. But so the DReps aren't voting by themselves in the case of a motion of no confidence or a new committee or quorum setting of the Constitutional Committee or hard fork initiation. Obviously, we want the SPOs involved if we're talking about a hard fork. I think that's sort of an imperative for governance here. The SPOs need to consent to hard forks. And it's obvious why we have them voting regardless of the AVST here in a motion of no confidence or setting a new committee and quorum for the Constitutional Committee, because the Constitutional Committee is not voting in those cases. And we don't want the DReps to be voting alone. We want some of the body to be involved there with them. So at this point, you could say you could make a reasonable argument that the SPOs are maybe the least important of the three bodies in this tricameral, ratifying entity. The DReps are certainly important because they're voting all the time. And you'd almost be tempted, I think some people will be tempted to say that the Constitutional Committee is unduly powerful and that maybe the Constitutional Committee is the most powerful. But if you think about it, and the SIP points this out, the DReps can get rid of the Constitutional Committee if they want to. The DReps, along with the SPOs, can get rid of the Constitutional Committee. So the SIP sort of hints that maybe the DReps are actually the most powerful out of the three entities in the body. But then you've also got this issue that the Constitutional Committee is sort of voting by vote, and the DReps and the SPOs are voting by stake they control. This brings up issues of whether governance of a blockchain ecosystem should be by stake or whether it should be by human body, human person. How many actual humans are voting on this? Maybe the vote should be by human, because of course the inevitable criticism is going to be that voting by stake involves rule of the rich. That's always going to come up. The critics will always say the rich rule this ecosystem if it's voting by stake. But I think the SIP makes a really good point about why this system doesn't envision this sort of voting by human in the case of the DReps and the SPOs, at least. Because if you do that, you have to have some kind of verification of identity. You have to get into all the intricacies of proving that one person is really one person. And the SIP points out that the only way to accomplish that is with an external oracle, which in a lot of cases is going to tend towards centralization, which the SIP authors think is a step in the wrong direction. I actually agree strongly with this. What we've seen so far is that anytime a blockchain ecosystem chooses centralization, some kind of problem crops up. And given what's possibly going to happen going forward with regulation, I think avoiding centralization in all of its forms is going to pay a lot of dividends for any ecosystem. So definitely agree with this. So it's at this point the SIP points out that the design of the DReps is still subject to change, and they shouldn't be confused with the Project Catalyst DReps. So everybody's heard this terminology DRep before, and it's generally in the context of the Project Catalyst DReps. They say registration of DReps and delegation to them will mimic the certificate system we currently use for stake pools. The role of the Constitutional Committee, according to SIP, is at least partially to bootstrap this framework, since they don't know how active and quick the community will be in registering as and delegating to DReps as soon as this whole framework goes live on chain. The committee will be required to adhere to the Constitution and ratify proposals in accordance with its provisions. And then they go on, and as I mentioned, they talk about how they are intentionally not requiring identity verification in this framework, since that would require some kind of centralized oracle, which they think would be that step in the wrong direction. So the rollout of this framework would be a two-part rollout. At first, they would only have 4 different possible governance actions: protocol parameters, hard forks, treasury withdrawals, which we said would come in 3 different sizes, and constitutional committee changes. In the first stage of this 2-stage rollout, there would be no DREP votes, only constitutional committee votes, plus they would have SPO votes in the case of a hard fork. Everything else would be implemented in stage 2. So in stage 1, we basically don't have the DReps voting on things. You just have the constitutional committee voting on things unless it's a hard fork. And in that case, the SPOs vote as well. Issues that remain to be discussed include off-chain DREP expectations, bootstrapping the Constitutional Committee, the initial Constitution itself, DREP incentives, and which values should be hard-coded versus protocol parameters in that ratification requirement table we looked at. That kind of complicated table where I said that the values, the actual values, would take the place of those kind of confusing looking little representations of values. In fact, we can just scroll right back to that table, that chart right here, if I can find it. Here you go. So all of these thresholds, these could either be hard coded or they could be protocol parameters that could be changed, and that's something that also needs to be decided. So we've got kind of a list of new protocol parameters that will need to be decided. We've got the governance action deposit amount. Remember, we said we have to avoid spamming. We have to have some kind of anti-spamming mechanism. We've got governance action expiration in terms of number of epochs. So these governance actions will expire if they aren't ratified, and we've got to decide how many epochs that will take. We've got thresholds for treasury withdrawals. Remember, we had small, medium, and large treasury withdrawals, and we've got the aforementioned ratification thresholds from that chart. They'll also need to decide which of those will be hard-coded and which will be updatable, as we talked about. The SIP does offer that the DReps arguably need to be compensated, and that an incentive mechanism would need to be designed along with some type of performance constraint so that we don't have millions of DReps that have this obligation to be voting every single epoch. Obviously, that is a formula for a lot of non-performance. If you expect millions of people to do pretty much anything every 5 days, that's probably not going to happen. So a few different ideas are offered here in the SIP, and those include requiring deposits to register as a DREP, an incentive scheme similar to the stake pool reward scheme, or some type of per epoch randomized subcommittee of DReps with stake weight taken into account. Whenever I hear about deposits, like this first option requiring deposits to register as a DREP, I always my instinctual gut feeling is that that's a bad idea. But again, we do need to prevent sort of people spamming themselves as DReps. I think you don't want to create a barrier to entry that's so high that only the rich can become DReps. But at the same time, you probably do want to have some kind of a barrier so that somebody doesn't get together with like, a club of like 100 people and, register every single one of them as a DREP for some kind of nefarious plot they're hatching or something. I don't know. Obviously, we want to have a lot of DReps if they're actually going to participate in the voting each epoch. I think that's great. If we have a lot of participation in government, that would be fantastic. But at the same time, if we're being realistic, I think we know that a lot of people will register and not vote. So there needs to be some kind of performance constraint to make sure that people who register are actually participating in the vote. And obviously we have these voting thresholds from that chart that make a difference. So all in all, I think this is a fantastic starting point. Like I said at the beginning, there are a lot of there are probably a lot of pieces of this that are going to expand and grow and be fleshed out to extents that are probably almost unbelievable here at the birth of all this. But I think this is a pretty fantastic starting point. We don't know. I don't think anybody's ever really done exactly this before. Certainly, we've seen different types of governments that have, bicameral, legislative bodies, and tricameral legislative bodies aren't, something that was unimagined before or anything like that. But doing this in a blockchain ecosystem like this hasn't quite been done before. So we don't really know. We don't really know what parts of this will work fantastically, what parts won't work at all, what kind of performance we will get out of the DReps, whether or not the Constitutional Committee will have too much power, too little power. We don't really know how any of that's going to work, but it seems like there are some checks and balances. The DReps and the SPOs can have no confidence votes in the Constitutional Committee and remove them and replace them with someone else if they want to. So this does seem to be a pretty balanced government. There will be the inevitable criticisms that it's, ruled by the rich. Of course, that's going to come up. But I do think that's better than some kind of centralized oracle that would be required to verify the identity if we try to go for one human, one vote kind of thing. And also, those kinds of things are, of course, susceptible to manipulation. Somebody could go out and round up a whole bunch of people and give them each, a couple ADA. And if it's one person, one vote, somebody could definitely manipulate the voting that way. Much harder to do if you actually have to acquire large amounts of ADA. So, I mean, there are trade-offs here, but I think this is a pretty good starting point, and it seems to be pretty well structured. Okay, so maybe I didn't mention every single paragraph in this SIP, but I think we did cover all of the substantive sections of the document, all of the important sections of the entire document we actually went through in this video. I hope this gives you an idea of this interesting discussion that I think is coming for us very soon in Cardano around this SIP. I think this is a good starting point, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.